Hello from Blades Music. Tonight's video is going to be a review of a number of EQ emulations, and it's really going to be just a piece of the which EQ should I use series of things. In the last one, we went over the Pro EQ2 from PreSonus. The one prior to that, just kind of a general overview of knowing which EQ you want to use. And in this one, we're going to be doing a review of a number of EQ emulations. Coming up next. So before I go into any detail on any of this, what I want to say up front is this disclaimer of what this video is and what it is not. Right? What this video is an overview of a bunch of different PreSonus emulations in the Fat Channel Collection. Now, if you have the Fat Channel Collection because you're a mixing board owner, or because you bought them outright, or because you're a member of Sphere, whatever that happens to be, the Fat Channel Collection is a bunch of EQs and a bunch of compressor emulations of a lot of sought-after units. I am a member of Sphere, and that's how I have access to these. It's going to be a look at all of the different ones that are available for the Fat Channel. That kind of covers a lot of ground, but there's a lot of similarities between these different units, and that's why I chose to cover them kind of all together. And it's a look at how to make a choice and to know what you have to choose between. Now, I could have gone out and bought a bunch of plugins. I could have downloaded a ton of demos from Waves and, pick your plugin manufacturer. I could have gotten a bunch of demos and put them on here and done a one-to-one comparison or whatever. That's not what I did. What I did here was really just kind of running through a number of different emulations from the same place, just so we can get a comparison and to be able to put some perspective on why you would choose one over another, or why you would choose any of these over one of the other choices that you might have. What this video is not is a comprehensive review of all of these EQ emulations. I mean, what I'm going to be showing here is going to be each emulation set to the same settings, or similar, as close to the same settings I can, on a single drum bus with nothing else being done. No compression, no EQ at the individual channels, no anything else. It's just going to literally be each EQ set to give or take the same settings on the drum bus. That is hardly comprehensive. And I know this. Going into the video, that was kind of like a decision that I made as to how am I going to scope this thing and make sure that I stay on topic and don't have like a 6-hour-long video dissertation on every EQ emulation that there is. Now, some might say that that's a mistake and that we should go into a lot more detail and we should do a one-to-one comparison. I will bet that if you do a Google search on any one of these emulations, you will find a dozen other videos that compare them all to each other, to other manufacturers, etc., etc. That's not really the point of the video. The point of the video is to show the breadth of options that you have. This is also not a comparison of the emulations to the real thing, or even to another plugin company's version of the same kind of an emulation. I could be here all night on any one of those topics. I don't have access to any of the physical ones. In fact, I've never used any of the physical ones that these emulations represent, nor am I familiar really with other plugin manufacturers of them, except the few cases where I have like in the Console 1, I've got an SSL 4000E, and I've got the British Class A, which is a Neve. I'm sure some of this kind of covers that ground, but I'm not doing a one-to-one comparison between them because, again, that's not the point of the video. And the last thing, and this should be true of any video that you watch, any instruction that you get about EQ, compression, or any other audio stuff having to do with recording, your DAW, etc., etc., this is not an absolute on anything about EQ. This is, again, overview, high level, how to kind of wrap your head around all of these different options that you have. When I first got a look at just a handful of these options, I was overwhelmed with how would I know which one of these things I'm supposed to use. So again, that's what we're trying to get to here. So looking at what we have on the screen, we are going to use the same little drum clip that I used for the previous examples. So here I've got on the drum bus my Fat Channel. Now, one of the great things about Fat Channel is that it's a whole channel strip. In this case, all I have enabled is the EQ, but you can see that I've got a high pass filter, a gate section, the EQ, a compressor, and then a limiter. I can switch those EQ to compressor or compressor to EQ around. It doesn't in this case matter because all I have enabled in this is the EQ module. In that EQ module position sits kind of somewhere in the middle. If you really didn't want to use any of these and you wanted to go to the Pro EQ2, you can see also here on the screen that on my drum bus, I have, scoot this stuff around a little bit. You can see I actually have a Pro EQ sitting before the Fat Channel. I have another Fat Channel over here after that I'm not using right now. But you could, if you weren't going to use the high pass filter, and if you weren't going to use the gate section, you could turn off the EQ here, turn on the Pro EQ for that channel, and then use the Pro EQ in that spot. Now this happens to be a Pro EQ that's on a different channel, but you get my point. This Pro EQ would then be feeding into the front end of this. You could also take that Pro EQ and stick it at the end of the chain if you wanted to do that. There's lots of options, but in this case, I'm going to be focusing on just the EQ section of the Fat Channel. Now, I do wish that PreSonus would consider taking all of these different modules out of the Fat Channel, allowing us to access them individually, but that case doesn't exist. So you could just put multiple Fat Channels on the same track and enable different pieces and parts on each one. Why would you do that? Well, let's say you wanted to use 2 of the compressors in a row, or if you wanted to use 2 of the EQs, if you wanted to use the general EQ first, and then you wanted to use something a little bit more colorful after it. You can load multiple Fat Channels on a single track, as you can see in this case. So to limit this down to just the EQ, I'm going to turn off the stack. And so now we're just looking at the EQ. When I looked at the Pro EQ before, you'll notice there's a similarity here between the Pro EQ2 and the what they call the standard EQ in the Fat Channel Collection. There are some similarities. They have that same kind of a graph. They have the same controls where you can drag the dots or change your frequencies or whatever by the numbers. The Pro EQ has a couple extra things on it. So you've got a low cut and a high cut specifically. Whereas in here, you would have to turn just your lowest frequency into a low shelf, which you could then, of course, boost or cut on that. Similarly to the way that you could on the Pro EQ on the low frequency here, or the high frequency up there where you can make those shelf or peaking. It doesn't have the linear and it doesn't have the graphical representation of the actual signal that's going through the channel. But aside from that, it's similar. The Pro EQ also has 5 bands, whereas the standard Fat Channel EQ has just 4. So let's get this guy out of here. Go away, you. Get that. All right, so now let's look at just the EQ section. We can use the standard, the passive, the vintage. These 3 are included by default with any of the Studio One stuff. The additional ones, the RC500 and the VT1, these 2 guys are available. I've seen free. I got them for free. They're also available in the Fat Channel Collection. And then all these other ones that you see listed here in the EQ section came with the Fat Channel Collection, and again, as a part of Sphere. So I'm going to go through each of these. I've already preset them to where they have very similar settings. So you can see what that basically means is I've put a shelf on the top and the bottom. So we have a shelf here and a shelf there. I've set them around 60 Hertz. There's a couple of these that I don't have 60 as an option in, so I did them at the closest thing, which is 50 or 72 in the case of the Baxandall. And on the top end, 10K where I could. Again, the Baxandall is the exception to the rule where they only had a 7.2 on that one, so that's where that's set. And then I'm doing a +4 on that bottom and a +4 on the top. I'm not doing anything in the middle. I'm going to reiterate. This is just one example. It's on a drum bus. Any one of these might have totally different effects for a different instrument. I'm focusing here on the drum bus, a guitar, a vocal, a violin, a mandolin, pick your thing. Each one of these might have a different function that fits better to those needs. The one that I'm not going to get into is the passive, right? And the passive is a Pultec style EQ. And if you're familiar with that, the oddity, I would call it an oddity, in that is you can boost and attenuate the same frequency level. And that's a strange thing to kind of wrap your head around. Now, the reason I'm not going into it here is, first of all, it's dissimilar to every other EQ in the range that I'm covering, which are all 3-band or 4-band, either parametric or partially parametric EQs. This one is so very different from any of those. But on top of that, this passive EQ, I hate it. It's terrible to me, at least on drums. I don't know, maybe it works on something else. But I think that the bottom end boost on it is so tubby as to be useless to me. So I'm going to be skipping over that one no matter what. But all the rest of these, you'll see I have them set for different frequency ranges. We're going to play the same thing through them. I'll pause and I'll flip between them so you can hear kind of like what the differences are as we go. So going back over to the standard EQ, this is what our drums sound like. Right now we've got nothing at all. And here's the standard. All right, so much like the Pro EQ, very similar in that there's not a lot of color, there's not a lot of pop and circumstance around the thing, just a little bit of boost on the top and the bottom, nothing fancy going on. So let's switch this over to the vintage. This is another of the included ones. Personally, I don't hear a whole heck of a lot of difference on this one. What I don't like about it is that you only have 4 options for the low and 3 options for the top. This is one of those cases, again, where I couldn't exactly approximate. I don't know that the 7.2, so you'll see I don't have that turned up. I have the high frequency shelf at the +4 dB. I don't know what high frequency is. It's just something more than 7.2 as the center. So that's what we're using on this one. And let's go back to the beginning and we'll play with no EQ and then we'll add it in. Let's try that again. Again, not a lot of character, not a lot of difference between this one, I think, and the standard one. And so we're going to move on now to the Alpine 550 EQ. And this is supposed to be an emulation of an API 550 EQ. What I like about this one is that it's very simple. It's also really aggressive, like the API consoles or any of the other emulations you might have heard of the API. I'm actually trying to get a new one for my console 1 for the API, just to have another flavor there. But what's simple about this is it has stepped frequencies and it has stepped gains as well. You can see I have the low shelf and the high shelf engaged on this as well. You do also have this filter that will cut off a little bit on the top and the bottom to kind of round out the EQ. I do not have that engaged right now. So you can see we're here at 50 Hertz and we've got a +4, 10K, and a +4. So here's with it in and with it out. Out first. Now I stayed on that one a little bit longer because it's definitely got a little bit more color, a little more presence. The bottom end has got a little more beef. The top end opens up, definitely has a wider bandwidth that's happening on that top end. And that's kind of the other thing about the API is that the Q changes dependent upon how much you boost it. The more you boost it, the tighter the Q is going to get. So since we're only at a boost of about 4, it's a pretty wide range. Now, going back to part of the conversation we had with the Pro EQ is the fact that you can see this graph. And all of the ones that I'm showing in this video, none of them has a frequency response graph. So you really don't know from a visual perspective what you're changing. You just have to rely on your ears, and honestly, a lot of that is going to rely on your source material. If your source material, and again, this goes back to which EQ should I use at the general level, if your source material doesn't have anything at 16K or 18K, it isn't going to matter if your bandwidth of the high frequency EQ covers that or not, because there's nothing there to boost. Same thing going down from there, you're likely going to have some high mids in something like a drum bus because you're going to have a snare and you're going to have some cymbals. So some of that high mid frequency stuff is going to get boosted by a wider Q, which is naturally going to make the whole thing a little bit louder, but also going to change the nuance of what that sounds like. Not being able to see it makes you have to rely completely on your ears and your knowledge of that particular EQ. All right, so moving along. So that is the Alpine 550. For what it's worth, out of the collection, this is one of the ones I like best. Next example is going to be the Baxandall EQ, and I don't know that I've ever heard of what the original of this thing is. It's a Dangerous Music Bax, I guess. I don't know that I'm real crazy about it anyway. Looking at it, it looks like it has, as many bands and everything, but really what you've got is you've got a low cut and a high cut on this thing. And then aside from that, you have a 2-band EQ. Here, so I've got my low cut and my high cut are turned off because I don't want to cut either one of those. Those are sort of again, that top and bottom, the same thing that the filter on the API one would do. But then we've got a shelf, and only a shelf. There's no way to make this a peaking EQ. Shelf only. We've got a shelf at 74, +4. And then we've got a shelf at 7.1 because I don't get a 10 option in here, and 18 is really kind of reserved for super high frequency stuff. Again, +4 on that. So here it is, unengaged, and then I'll bring it in. Now, it's not an exact comparison to the others because of the frequency differences. Again, 74 versus either 60 or 50, depending upon which of the other emulations I'm using, and then 7.1K versus 10K on the other examples. Not exactly the same comparison. I will say that I do like the way that this one sounds. It just doesn't have as much extremity that you can do to it. So if you really need to affect something strongly, this is probably not going to be your choice. You'll see you only have a +5 even capability on either of those two bands. It's also only a 2-band shelf EQ and a cut, right? So it's really, really wide feature choice for your material. The next one in here is the RC500. And initially, I really liked this one. What I don't like about it is it's a little brittle. So a plus and a minus on this one is there is no stepping on these controls. So either for the gain or for the frequency, you don't really know the exact frequency you're at, nor the exact amount of gain. I've got them both, again, set to shelf, but you can see that I am at about 50. If I were to move this dial at all, it's going to move completely variable, and it does not tell you what number it's at. It's just someplace between 50 and 75 or whatever. Same thing with the gain. At 12 o'clock, that would be 0 gain, and all the way over is +16. Everything else in between, Wild West. You guess what it might be. Now, if you listen to this thing, I think that what you're going to find is that the bottom end isn't as pronounced as like the Alpine, but the top end is more so. I think that the Q on the thing is a little wider. But also to me, on the high end, this one is a little bit brittle. But if you're trying to pull some high end out of stuff that doesn't have as much as you want, this might actually be a good choice. So here's nothing, and then bringing it in. Now in this example, I'm actually going to bring it in a little bit for where the shaker comes in, so you can really hear some of that high-end stuff that's getting added in here. It's a bunch of detail that's up there. And in a mix, this definitely could bring some of that detail into the mix if you're having a hard time getting it in there. So again, this will bring in that high-end detail, the real sizzly part of that shaker. Not just the chicka part, but the actual of the sliding of those beads across the plastic is really brought out by this particular EQ. So again, this could be one of those kinds of things where you might want to stack this one in addition to the others to kind of get that particular sound. Moving on. Next example is going to be the Solar 69. This one is in a close second to me for the passive. Of the EQs in this collection, I don't care for. One, I don't really like the sound of it. And two, the controls are just weird on this one. All the other ones, the controls are pretty understandable. You have a low frequency and you have a gain or a cut. You might have a Q. In this one, if you look here, and this is where it's particularly strange, is here on the low frequency on the bass here, and this is supposed to be, I guess, a Helios Type 69 is what this is emulating. Super popular, I guess, in a ton of albums and whatnot, but it's a little strange to use. So you can see on the low frequency knob here, flat is here in the middle, and then as we move it counterclockwise, we get the hertz, which frequency we're actually going to be doing something with. And in this case, it's going to be adding, right? So we're going to be adding more of 60 or 100 or 200 or 300 with this knob here. So from 0 going around and adding dBs. If we put this under flat, this knob up here doesn't do any of the cut. Under flat just cuts 3 dB, 6 dB, 9 dB, 12, 15 at 50 hertz only. So this one knob is kind of a weird dual purpose thing where it either chooses the frequency if it's above flat, or it chooses the amount of cut at 50 hertz if it's below flat. If it's above, this knob controls how much gain for these frequencies. If it's below, this knob doesn't do anything at all. Moving over, you have the same thing here with the mid, where you've got, is it a peak or is it a trough, and how much at this frequency. And then at the top end, you have an adjustment of 10K, period. So in this case, I'm doing a plus 4 dB on 10K, but you don't get anything outside of that 10K. And then over here, you can change the level, which is, I'm either going to subtract or I'm going to add level based upon where this dial is. And then, of course, you can change the phase on the way out as well. So this one's a little bit weird in its controls, but listen to it, and I think that you'll hear the same thing I'm hearing, where the low end is a little bit thuddy, tubby, and the high end doesn't have anywhere near as much presence and brightness as some of the others. So going back to the beginning, starting with it out. So you can hear in there some of that thickness in that low mid section. It's coming out on the kick, on the high part of the kick. It's coming out on the low part of the snare. And to me, at least for this application of it, it's not flattering. It also doesn't bring up a whole lot of the high end, even though I've got a plus 4 at 10K, just like I do in the other examples. So moving on to the next one, I'm actually going to skip over the tube EQ, and the reason I'm skipping over that is it's more of a mid-range EQ, doesn't have the same function as these other ones. So we're going to skip that, and we're going to go to the Vintage 3-band, which is a Neewer style. This one is probably one of the ones I like best. Between this one and the Alpine probably wins by a little. This one's second. Actually, I like my Console 1 Neewer emulation better than this by a pretty good margin, but this one has a very similar flavor to that. What's cool about this one is that there are no markings at all. You have absolutely no idea what you're doing, so you can only go by your ears. You can see the markings on the frequency up here, but nothing on what this gain is. I don't know if this top of the plus is 15, 12, 3. I have no idea. Now, of course, I think it's probably something like 10 or 12. There's actually between the 0 mark and up here, there's 10 notches that you can go to. So whatever that means to you. I've kind of tried to approximate what I think might be plus 4 for this, and then also plus 4 on the 10. And I'm not doing a high shelf at all. I'm not changing the phase on the way out, and this button here just turns the EQ on and off. So again, here we go, starting with it out, bringing it in. So I think this one is actually pleasing. It's very flexible. It sounds nice. It's not super extreme in any way. I think it actually brings out a little bit of air in the kick drum that some of the other ones don't. I don't know why, but it does. This one, again, very flexible because there's no stepping on any of these controls for the gains. There is stepping here on the frequencies. And then the last one in the line is the VT1, and this one's a little bit different because it's 4-band, first of all. I do have the shelving for the top and bottom bands, the top and the bottom bands. It's actually backwards where the peak is the exception where you turn it on, and otherwise it's actually shelving. So I've done those, again, like the RC one, the RC500, the VT1 behaves similarly where these knobs can be put wherever you want them. So right now I'm at 60-ish hertz and about +4. I'm just under the 12K mark, so I'm guessing it's somewhere around 10K, and about +4. This one sounds different because it's a tube emulated EQ, and this one I'd probably put in third place of the ones I like. It can be a little bit brittle like the RC500 one, but I think this one kind of sounds nice. So let's take it from the beginning, starting with it out, bringing it in. Now, a few of the things I really like about this is I think it actually adds almost like a transient designer feel to the kick drum, gives it a little bit more length and depth, a little bit more roundness, while at the same time still giving you a nice boost up there on the top end. And this one does have the flexibility of 2 mid bands instead of just 1. And there's some overlap between those 2 mid bands, right? So you can go up to 2K over here, and on this other mid band over here, you can go below 2K. So you have the ability to kind of adjust those two with a little bit of cross between them in terms of how they function. Now what I want to do is I'm going to go back to the beginning of this list, and I'm real quickly just going to run through one section of this drum bit, and I'm going to go from one EQ to the next so you can hear an actual comparison, not just from nothing to each one, but I'm going to switch directly between the different EQs. Here we go. So as you can hear, as you go between them, the flavors are very different between them. They're similar to each other. You can hear there's obviously a boost on the bottom, there's a boost on the top. But if you were to take this and apply it across an entire mix, you can definitely tell how just choosing between different EQs can make a huge difference in the overall tone of each individual track, of each individual bus, and then overall on the whole thing. Part of the point of this series of things is which EQ should I use is trying to get you to figure out which one do you like for each source. This can certainly become analysis paralysis really fast, right? That's one of the reasons I like the Console 1 so much. I like my British Class A for my drums. Every time, that's what I'm tending towards using. And then maybe I'll use the SSL bus compressor from someplace else on that drum bus. But in general, that's what I'm going to do with my drums each time, unless I just really want to go for something different or to get my head into a different creative space. I hope this video has been useful to you in deciding how you want to approach your EQ, and maybe putting a little bit of context around what these different EQs sound like. Or even if you don't have the collection, would you even want to spend the money to get the collection to get these different flavors? If you would, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with somebody else, click the reminder bell if you do subscribe so that you'll be reminded of additional videos that I put out in the future if you found this one useful. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching, and have a good one.